First Kings. Well, we're back here in a very, very ancient time, long before the time of Christ. Let's put this in its context. The Old Testament, of course, goes all the way back to Genesis, to the creation, but the real story kind of catches hold when you come up to Abraham. That's when the story of the children of Israel begins. 2000 BC. That's an easy date to remember for Abraham. Then, hundreds of years later, you have Moses freeing the people who had, in the meantime, become enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. There was a period of the patriarchs and 400 and some years in Egypt. Moses comes along and got them out. This is when the first books began to be written down, the first 5 books of the Bible, Pentateuch. Immediately following Moses was Joshua. He leads the people into the Promised Land. Then there follows a lengthy period of time called the time of the Judges. Almost 300 years. So Moses about 1440, okay. Joshua, then the Judges, about a 300-year period where charismatic leaders would be raised up by God. There was no formal fixed government in the nation. But if there was an oppressor, if people were raiding them or occupying their country, then God would raise up these charismatic leaders to bring them freedom from their enemies. But around 1100 BC, the Jews opted for monarchy. And so just in the 11th century BC begins a period known as the United Monarchy. It's about 130 years long. And it started with the first king of Israel, Saul. He turned out to be a loser. And so he was replaced then by David, the author of so many of the Psalms, real well known, a great hero in the Old Testament. And then David was replaced, as we'll see tonight, by Solomon when he died. Each of these three had long reigns in the 40-year range, so the United Monarch. Shortly after then Solomon's death, the kingdom split into two. The northern part is referred to as Israel. The southern part is referred to as Judah. Most often. They use other terms as well for both the northern and southern. Those are the most common terms. And a dynasty of kings proceeds to develop in both countries. They're both, so it's a divided monarchy. This whole period here, which then here's when all of the prophets, books of the prophets were written during the time of the divided monarchy. Then along about in the 700s, the late 700s, remember the dates go down in the BC period instead of up. The Assyrians absolutely annihilated the northern kingdom. They did a huge amount of damage in the southern kingdom too, but they were not able to conquer it. This all came about as the prophets, Isaiah, and you look at Amos, and some of the earlier prophets, it's all about the fact that they insisted on worshiping idols and a lot of other things as well, caused God to withdraw His protection from them. And so then these vicious, warlike empires that were spreading around the world would come in and just tear them to pieces. And they exported a lot of the people up there as slaves. The northern kingdom ceased to exist permanently from that date forward. These are the so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel. It's somewhat of a misnomer because members of each of those tribes were living in the southern part as well, so that there are representatives of all 12 tribes, even up in to the time of Christ. Then about 100 and some years later, the Babylonians did the same thing for the southern kingdom and completely conquered it. But in this case, they gathered together large numbers of Jews and took them with them back to Babylon, where they became basically a slave population there. This was something that ancient empires often did. You either, to make people stop fighting you, you either killed everyone, which they did on a regular basis, total genocide, or you export them out of their land and then they don't have anything to fight for anymore. It's the connection of the people and the land that causes them to fight. They lose their fight once they're out of their land. That's what they did with the Jews. They took them back, and this had all been predicted by God. This happens, so we're in the 500s BC by now. And then the Babylonians fell from power and were replaced by the Persian Empire. And they started returning back to Israel. In a series, there was 3 major emigrations back from Babylon into Israel. And so that's the period of the return, obviously. And by the time everyone was back, you're down pretty close to 400 BC, which is the end of the Old Testament. Then there is no scriptural record from 400 BC until the New Testament. But there are other books that were written during that time that give us the history of the period, but they weren't considered to be scripture because they weren't written by prophets. Our books that we're going to be studying start in this united monarchy period and go through the whole divided monarchy. It's written at the end of that period, so apparently written during the exile. And in the exile, the Jews were in a funny position because they're sitting there saying, this really hasn't worked out the way we expected at all. We're supposed to be a kingdom. We're supposed to exist forever. We're supposed to be in the plan of God. There's this Abrahamic covenant, that was made. And we'll see there's also a Davidic covenant that was made. And it's, what are we doing in Babylon? Where is our kings? It's like, this just shouldn't be happening. 1st and 2nd Kings are a theological history. It's not really a chronicle where they're just trying to tell everything that happened, but rather they're selecting the significant events and analyzing how did we come to be in this place? Why does this happen? And what are we to think of God, that we find ourselves in the position we're in? And that's what it is. Let's dive in. 1:1. Now King David was very old, and no matter how many blankets covered him, he could not keep warm. I hate it when that happens. I've been having that problem. So his advisors told him, let us find a young virgin to wait on you and look after you, my lord, and she can lie in your bosom and keep you warm. Well, they searched throughout the land of Israel for a beautiful girl, and they found Abishag of Shunem and brought her to the king. The girl was very beautiful, and she looked after the king and took care of him, but the king had no sexual relations with her. You got to keep warm. What can you say? Sounds like it works. The reason she's being brought up is that she comes up later in the story. What about that time, David's son Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, began boasting, I will make myself king. So he provided himself with chariots and charioteers and recruited 50 men to run in front of him. This was kind of like an advertising campaign. This is kind of like the presidential campaign back then. To make people recognize you as king, you got to act like a king, you got to look like a king, and having 50 men trotting along in front of your chariot, it looks pretty, it's kind of like a parade going by every time this guy goes down the street.